Okay, thank you everybody. I'm here to talk about the outlook for water resources in the Murray system in the coming season. I thought, just as a little bit of context though, the diagram up there is the Murray Darling Basin, very complex network of rivers, Queensland in the top, in the reddy colour, New South Wales, the Murray system, which is what I'll be talking about in the blue, and of course the Victorian tributaries. The MDBA has a role in implementing the basin plan across all of the Murray Darling Basin and looking at making sure water's shared equitably for all uses, including the environment and consumptive use, cultural values and the like. But specifically in river operations, we work on the River Murray system and we assist South Australia, Victoria and New South Wales in sharing the water of the River Murray. This system diagram of the Murray, a couple of key things to note. The major storage is Hume and Dartmouth at the upstream end of the system. Yarrawonga Weir, a bit further downstream, where the major diversions are into the Mulwala and Yarrawonga Main Canal. Key re-regulating storage at Lake Victoria, which enables us to move water through the system early in the season and have it available for delivery later on. And then of course South Australia, where the regulation of the river that the MDBA undertakes is to the South Australian border. Beyond that, South Australia manages the river. What I wanted to start with was just a touch on how water in the Murray is shared. This is fundamental to how allocations are developed by the states, and certainly in the current season where allocations have been relatively high in Victoria, but the general security allocation in New South Wales has remained at zero. Water sharing arrangements are very fundamental to that. There's been a lot of consternation in the community about those discrepancies, so I thought it'd be worthwhile just touching on how this works. It's embedded in the Murray Darling Basin Agreement. It's been agreed between the states and been in place for a long time. The thing to remember, of course, is water in the system is finite. To give more to one group means you've got to give less to another. So making changes to these sharing arrangements, very, very, very challenging to get agreement to that. But anyway, I'll just run through how they work. Same thing as the previous diagram, system diagram, Hume and Dartmouth, the upstream end, the Murray River coming through, Barmer Choke here where it changes course. Water that comes into the system upstream of Albury, so from the Snowy scheme, the Upper Murray, the Mitamita River, including water that comes from Dartmouth and the Kiwa system, is shared equally between New South Wales and Victoria, 50-50. Water that comes into, and also water that comes into Menindee Lakes in the Darling, and of course there's no water there at the moment, but water that comes into Menindee also shared 50-50 between New South Wales and Victoria. Water that comes in the Victorian tributaries downstream of Albury, so the Ovens River, Broken, Goulburn, Campaspe, Loddon, Voca, remains Victorian water. So we keep track of how much water's in store, where it came from, and we keep running accounts of how much water each of the states is available. So those Victorian tributaries remain Victorian. On the other side of the river, water that comes in Billabong Creek and the Murrumbidgee is New South Wales water. And the current season has been quite challenging because the improvements we have had in the water resource in the Murray have mostly come from the Victorian side, and that's seen Victorian resource build, whereas New South Wales, the drought that's very prevalent in northern New South Wales has been touching on the Murray system as well, and so flows from the Murrumbidgee and stuff have been very, very low. It's important to understand that sharing arrangement because it does go to what might happen in coming seasons as well. So water comes into the system, shared between New South Wales and Victoria. New South Wales and Victoria are then obligated to meet South Australia's entitlement flow and their share of the available resource in equal parts. So that's how it works. That's the bulk water arrangements. MDBA keeps track of those. We regularly make assessments of how much water we think will be available for the entire year. So we project forward from how much water we've got currently in store, what's already been used, project forward with fairly conservative assumptions so we don't overestimate how much might be available. We provide advice to the states about how much their shares might be, and then they use their entitlement frameworks to allocate that out to entitlement holders. In doing that, there's a number of factors that we do to ensure there's some resilience in the system. And part of that is about setting aside reserves of water to underpin allocations. The first thing we need to do is make sure there's enough water in the system to actually run the river. You need some water in the river to keep it flowing so that you can deliver consumptive entitlements and water for other purposes for the environment on top of that. So there's a reserve, conveyance water it's called, that we need to build, 1,596 gigalitres. It's a big number. The Murray's a big system. Of that, about 150 gigalitres is water that we know will evaporate off the storages. 750 gigalitres, thereabouts, and this number we adjust during the year to when we understand how conditions are unfolding, and this year that's been a bit higher. 750 gigalitres or thereabouts to run the system between the upstream storages and the South Australian border. That's met equally between Victoria and New South Wales. And then 696 gigalitres of what's called South Australian dilution and loss allowance. It's part of the total South Australian entitlement, but that's the water that's required to run the river in South Australia between the South Australian border and Wellington. So water in excess of that can then go to allocations. As well as making sure we've got enough water to run the river, set aside, or the states need to set aside water for critical human water needs to make sure that's given the highest priority, to make sure that's available. And they also need to set aside, or we do on their behalf, a further 225 gigalitres to make sure we've got sufficient water in the following year to be able to deliver critical human water needs if we get into really, really dry conditions. There's a tier system that exists in the agreement. Tier 1, normal water availability, that's where we are now. Tier 2 is when we get to a very low water availability and all we have is enough to deliver critical human water needs, and it allows for sharing arrangements to be varied between the states. And Tier 3, which we hope we don't see ever, is extremely low water availability, something we've never seen before, much worse than the Millennium Drought. Go on to current conditions. This graph shows in the blue very even line the average storage volume in the Murray system over time. So typically, on average, peaks at around 7,000 gigalitres, drops down to 5,000 gigalitres and cycles about it. This is the trend over time, the Millennium Drought period through here where storages were very low. Here's where we are now. You'll see in the current previous winter, very little recovery in the storages and we're trending down, and of course the remainder of this season that line we would expect to continue to trend down. Very similar to 2015, 16. Of course in 2016, the end of 2016 we had the large floods on the Murray and a very rapid improvement in resource. We can't say what's going to happen from here. We've had very dry conditions over a lot of the basin. Catchments are very dry. We know that the first time we get rain, a lot of that is just going to soak into the ground. It's going to take a while for inflows to build. So coming to the resource outlook, and there is some high degree of uncertainty about the outlook for next year at this time of the season. The typical large inflow periods in the basin are in winter and spring. So what happens in this coming winter and spring is absolutely critical to water availability. This blue chart shows the unregulated inflow to Hume Dam in the long term. The blue is the long term, that's the average, and then there are confidence limits around that, 25 to 75% confidence limits, and then 5 to 95. The dots along the bottom of where we've tracked what we've actually seen. So we've been tracking quite low, very low, along the bottom of historic record, sort of around the 5 to 10% inflows. And based on the Bureau's outlook for the coming 3 months, we wouldn't expect a great improvement. Likely to continue to track there, and even at the 95%, only small improvements. But that is typical of this time of year. We don't expect to get a lot of inflow through this period. As I said, we have very dry catchments. We've had very dry, hot season. The Bureau's latest outlook for the next 3 months is a bias towards dry conditions and ongoing hot weather. Those things combined mean there's a fairly great, or a greater chance of low inflows over the coming 3 months. So unless we get significant rainfall, we expect relatively low improvements in the resource availability. While allocations are a matter for the states, the resource managers in both Victoria and New South Wales have put out outlooks for the coming season, and in the dry scenario, which tends to be where we think we're tracking, it's likely that we would open on zero allocation in both Victoria and New South Wales, and improvements will be dependent on winter and spring rains. So I guess that's the sort of the scenario for where we're at. There's a few things that are sort of driving changes in river operations and challenges around how we deliver water, and I thought it'd be worthwhile touching on those because they do go to some of the challenges we've got in managing the river, which flows on to how people operate their businesses and the availability of water. One of the things that we're seeing now, of course, is very active water trade markets, and David's going to talk about water pricing in the next presentation. But certainly the movement of water around the system, the last couple of years we've seen that water hasn't traded from the Murrumbidgee into the Murray. That presents challenges to us in operating the system because in past seasons we've actually had access from water in the Murrumbidgee, which we've been able to deliver to meet demands further downstream in the Murray. But certainly developments further downstream are causing challenges in moving water through the system and us having to make decisions about when we make releases to have water available versus holding it back with the opportunity to capture any inflows that might emerge downstream of the major storages. We certainly have a large environmental water portfolio that's now available. Jodie will talk about that a bit later. How that is used, the timing of when that is used, puts pressure on the system. Typically through sort of winter and spring, we would be setting the system up to meet delivery of consumptive demands later on in the season and using that time to move water to Lake Victoria and the like. Now, with a large environmental water portfolio and the desire to utilise that in that same time, there's contention or contest for capacity through the system, and we need to work our way through that. We're certainly seeing changing inflow patterns and the translation of rainfall into inflow. The last couple of years in particular, very hot seasons, we've seen record high temperatures in a number of parts of the basin, including along the Murray. We're seeing losses increase as a result. We're certainly seeing rainfall not translating to the same level of inflow that we've seen in the more historic record. So we're certainly having to adapt to that and understand what we may or may not get out of tributary inflows. And I've mentioned the trade, but changing agricultural practices, development in Sunraysia, movement of water further down through the system all put pressures on the system. This slide, and I'll flick through this pretty quickly because I don't want to take too long, I'm probably getting close. Yep. This just shows the development that's gone on in the system over time. So you've got the Goulburn River here, Sunraysia region, the Murray Valley, both sides of the river there. And 1887, the first development around Mildura and a bit more around Kelwa, Moorbeen, Pomona, Red Cliffs and Robinvale. So up to late 1940s, the end of the war, about 17,000 hectares of development. In the 60 years from then on, the enlargement of a number of the major storages, the Goulburn, Eildon and other storages, saw a large expanse in development, another 40,000 hectares. And then since then, in the 20 years after that, very large developments, another further 75,000 hectares or up to that, so it's doubled again. And the distribution of that and the challenges of moving water through the system with that is certainly causing some problems and issues for us to continue to work through. There's a range of things we're doing to improve how we operate the system so we can meet the demands that are required. Investing a lot in new technologies, tools and systems so we can scenario plan better and understand how we might move water through the system. We're testing the rules and possible operations under future scenarios, looking at changing climate, what that might mean, how we deliver water for the environment, the impacts of trade. And certainly in the current season it's become really a hot topic, but the management of the Barmah choke and how we get water past that significant restriction in the system. So just to wrap up, summary of the outlook, and you know, it's, as I said at the start, we're still a fair way out from the major inflow period when we'd expect the major inflows. So, you know, can go anywhere from here. But the Bureau's outlook is a bias towards ongoing dry and hot conditions for the next 3 months. We have dry catchments now, and they're likely to continue to dry. So any rainfall we get is likely to only result in low inflows. The opening allocation outlook, as put out by the Victorian New South Wales resource managers, suggests it's likely to be low or zero at the start of the season, and improvements on that will really depend on winter and spring rains. Last thing I'll say about that is you really need to look to the state resource managers for their updated allocation outlooks in coming months. That's the source of information. The role of the MDBA is to share the bulk water between the states. It really is around how the states then allocate it to their entitlement holders.